Welcome to the Storytelling That Sticks for Business and Life podcast. I'm your keynote, TED Talk and story coach, Doug Stevenson. In this podcast series, I'm going to share with you some simple and practical storytelling techniques and hacks that will make you stand out from the competition so that you can get paid to speak, or to give a TED Talk that goes viral, or to simply tell your story in a way that makes a difference in the world. You'll learn how to choose, craft, and deliver stories that stick. Personal stories from your amazing life, business stories, leadership and sales stories, stories that are marketable and memorable, stories that sell you and your product or service. My job as your virtual keynote and story coach is to help you design and deliver stories and speeches that get people to do what you want them to do, or to consider a new perspective. If you're serious about using storytelling to advance your career, to get paid to speak, or simply to get your message across in a more engaging and compelling manner, this podcast is for you. All right, well, let's get started. Episode 41. 12 story types to choose from, Part 1. As we flip the calendar from 2023 to 2024, and we begin to segue into season 3 of the Storytelling That Sticks for Business and Life podcast, I'm so jazzed about that. I want to take you on a story safari to help you identify lots of different story possibilities for you to choose from in 2024 and beyond. Now, many of you listening to this podcast tell me that you struggle to figure out which stories to tell and which ones to skip. Now, as we get into this topic, I've decided to break this podcast about story types into 2 parts. I'll do 4 story types in this episode and 8 in the next episode. Now, I remember a coaching client coming to me a while back with a story that he wanted help on. And so I said, all right, go ahead and tell me the story. And after he told me the story, I had to pause for a second and say, what's the point of that story? I don't know why you're telling it to me. And he said, very enthusiastically, it doesn't have a point. I just like it because it's funny. And I said, well, you're right. It was funny. But if you don't know what the point is or why you're telling it, it has no strategic value in a speech or presentation. I don't want that to happen to you, that you decide to tell a story for the wrong reason, because it's funny or dramatic or meaningful to you, but the story doesn't have a relevant point or lesson, something that someone else can learn from and use. So this process that I want to take you through should help you identify a number of story possibilities. But remember this, every story must make a point or teach a lesson that's relevant to your subject and to the business context you're speaking in. This is storytelling in business. Now, if you read books and articles on storytelling like I do, or if you do a Google search for different types of story, you'll find lots of storytelling experts and authors who've come up with different names for different types of stories. Well, that's what I did when I came up with my 12 types. In my book, Doug Stevenson's Story Theater Method, which you can buy on Amazon, by the way, you can buy it as a downloadable or as a paperback. I identify 7 types of story that you can choose from when considering what story to tell. Now, I'm including the 7 types from my book here, but I'm also adding a few new ones. Now, by sharing these story types, my hope is that you'll be able to go on your own story safari and identify the meaningful moments and experiences from your life that you can use as the basis for crafting stories you can tell that will make a point, make a positive impression, and grow your business. So as you're listening to the list of story types, jot down your ideas for potential stories. Just let the ideas flow. You may want to open a Word file on your computer or find a pad of paper and a pen, because this list, I got to tell you, this list is going to give you lots of ideas and you're going to want to capture them. Don't think you'll just remember them later, because I don't know about you, but I never remember everything that I thought was a great idea later on. I just don't. I need to write stuff down. Now, you can always come back later and decide which ones to develop after you identify the lesson or point the story makes. So here we are with the first four of the 12 types of story that I've come up with. Number one, the vignette. A vignette is defined as a short illustration or a brief descriptive incident or scene. It's a mini story that only takes a minute or two to tell. It's the kind of story you may come up with at the last minute based on something that just happened, or it could be more like an anecdote that's not fully developed with all the dramatic arc of a full-blown story. A vignette can also be a shortened or abbreviated version of a longer story. You just take out most of the details and stick to the most basic elements that will make the story work to make the point you want to make. Now, a vignette will never have the emotional impact of the types of stories I'm about to discuss, but vignettes can be effective in a setting where you're not given much time to make your presentation. Number two are crucible stories. Now, a crucible is defined as a severe test. They're stories of great loss, hardship, or pain. These are the most dramatic and powerful stories you can tell, and more often than not, they require the most development and skill to deliver. They're often survivor stories that tell of near misses, encountering danger and severe challenges and coming out alive. They're powerful because they show the incredible determination to overcome whatever obstacle stands in your way. They reveal the human spirit at its most inspiring level. Now, I've coached many people with crucible stories over the years. The first one that comes to mind is a man who climbed Mount Everest and nearly died. And then there's my friend Leanne Tiemann, who flew to Vietnam in the last days of the Vietnam War to rescue hundreds of orphan babies. Her story is harrowing and scary as she was racing against time to get babies out of the city as the Viet Cong was closing in. You can hear her story in episode 32. Now, another crucible story is about a man I coached who lost both legs when a huge boulder fell on him. And then there's the woman who had a heart attack and had to relearn how to do basic things. Or my friend John Register, an athlete who was on a glide path to competing in the Olympics when his leg clipped a hurdle in a qualifying race. John ended up losing his leg, and his dream of becoming an Olympic champion were dashed. You can hear his story in episode 38. And another crucible story was a woman who lost her husband in the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Center towers in Manhattan. Now, some of the most powerful movies are built around a crucible story, such as The Titanic or Naiad. Another one is Beasts of No Nation, Schindler's List, Romeo and Juliet, Dunkirk, Boys in the Hood, Terms of Endearment, and many more. Now, if you have a story of a severe test, a life-changing experience where you overcame great difficulty, your story can be powerful and inspiring to others if you take the time to work on it. Craft it using my 9 steps of story structure and get some coaching on how to deliver it. Crucible stories can be uplifting if told well, in service of your audience, but they can also be self-indulgent and gratuitous if they're not developed correctly. Number 3 are imbroglio stories. An imbroglio, and I love that word. Don't you love that word, imbroglio? An imbroglio is defined as an embarrassing situation, a colossal screw-up, a painful misunderstanding. It's a comedy of errors story where something went horribly wrong and ended up going so far wrong that it became comical. It's usually based on something that ordinarily wouldn't be a big deal, but because of how embarrassing and humiliating it was, it becomes funny. Steve Allen, A talk show host and comedian from long, long ago said, and I love this, comedy is tragedy plus time. Comedy is tragedy plus time. And I think that's exactly right. Because at the time the imbroglio moment was happening, it wasn't funny. But with time and perspective and the ability to laugh at one's own self, you can turn that tragedy, or at least that embarrassing moment, into comedy gold. And believe me, if you want to get paid to speak, you need to have some comedy, some humor. Now, my imbroglio story, my streaking story, is based on an experience I had with an acting exercise that led to me going streaking and getting arrested naked. That's right, I got arrested naked in public. It was embarrassing and humiliating at the time. But when the other actors in my acting class heard about what happened to me, that I got arrested naked, they all cracked up, they all laughed. And that's when I knew that my most humiliating experience, getting arrested naked, thrown in the back of a cop car, handcuffed naked, I realized that would be a good story. And that's when I had to get to work and figure out how I'd use it and what the point would be. Because just because a story is funny or hilarious doesn't mean you can use it in a business context. It's got to make a point. And I eventually figured out what that point was. If you have any intention of becoming a professional speaker and getting paid, you need at least one imbroglio story. The people who hire speakers, at least non-celebrity speakers, want you to provide some humor in your presentations. I realized early on that I wasn't good at telling jokes or one-liners. How about you? Are you good at telling jokes? Well, I'm not. But I could tell a funny story, and that's where I got my laughs. So look back into your past for those moments when something went wrong, something you did, or something that happened to you that was embarrassing or got out of hand, or where you did something dumb and you're able to laugh about it now. Just remember those things and just write down the moment, the event, the situation. And to learn how you can turn that potentially funny incident into a hilarious story, go back and listen to episode 25, How to Get More Laughs. Now, one of the things that I love to do is watch comedians on YouTube. And I love to study how they do it. How do they get a laugh? What is the setup? What is the situation? What is the context? How do they use their face? How do they use their body? How do they use exaggeration and volume? So here's a list of a couple of funny ladies for you to watch on YouTube. And some of these people are telling imbroglio stories. So the first one is Sarah McMillican. And then there's Aisling B, Leanne Morgan, and then finally Taylor Tomlinson. Watch these ladies on YouTube and you will see how to become a funny person. Okay, number 4. You ready for number 4? Number 4 are credibility stories. Now, a credibility story adds credibility to the premise or main point of your speech by having a third party prove your point, by adding their voice in support of your idea. That person may be famous, well-respected, or a knowledgeable expert that is known to your audience members. Your resource for credibility stories may come from a book, an article or thesis from a famous speech, or perhaps from a biography of someone famous. Now, when you reference Ken Blanchard or Steve Jobs or Brene Brown or Malcolm Gladwell or Sheryl Sandberg or Roz Brewer, your credibility is enhanced. To add their credibility to your argument, your premise, you may only need to use a quote or a vignette. So here's an example. When I was speaking at Google, when I was hired to speak at Google, I told the story of the creators of Google, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, and how they were able to raise their first startup capital by telling a story to an investor. I used their credibility by telling a story of how they used a story to get what they needed, investment capital, startup capital, to bolster my premise. that storytelling is a strategic and essential business skill. Now, I also referenced Simon Sinek. He's really big right now. He's the author of the best-selling book, Start With Why. I show a graphic that he created called the Golden Circle in my training courses when I'm talking about how stories connect with a part of the brain that wants to know and understand why. When I can show how Simon Sinek is making a similar point to what I'm saying, it bolsters my credibility and shows that what I'm talking about isn't just my opinion. I've also used references from Daniel Pink from his book, A Whole New Mind, from Chip and Dan Heath from their book, Made to Stick, and so on. So here's the deal. Coming into professional speaking, I had never worked in a corporation. I'm not a corporate guy. I've always been an entrepreneur. I was an actor. I was a realtor. I was a carpenter. And so I started to realize early on, since I'm not a corporate guy, I need to bring in corporate people into my speeches. I need their credibility to give me more credibility. And who doesn't want that, right? So let's just recap the first four story types. Number one is the vignette. Number two, Crucible Stories. Number three, Imbroglio Stories. And number four, credibility stories. Okay, we're going to cover the next 8 in part 2. All right, well, that's it for this episode. If you feel that you learned something valuable today, something that you can use that will make your stories stick, stories that make you and your business memorable, marketable, and monetizable, there are 3 things I'd like you to do. First, click on the follow or subscribe button and leave a review wherever you listen. And second, share this podcast with your friends and coworkers, your email list, and on social media. And third, connect with me on LinkedIn. And when you're ready to get serious about taking your stories to the next level, or if you have an important speech, presentation, or TED Talk coming up, or if you want some guidance on how to make the transition to becoming a professional speaker, let's schedule your free 30-minute coaching session where we can get to know each other and see if we're a good fit. And as always, I'd love to hear from you with your questions and comments. Let me know that you're out there listening and learning. You can send an email with your questions, comments, and suggestions to Deborah@DougStevenson.com. That's Deborah, DEBORAH, @DougStevenson.com. Hey, thanks for listening. Until the next episode, I'm Doug Stevenson.